They didn't see it coming, not because it was hidden, but because they never imagined someone from a country like Burkina Faso would dare. For years, Ibrahim Traoré had been labeled many things: a transitional leader, a military placeholder, a curious young upstart. But what he really was, what they didn't dare say, was dangerous. Not because he carried weapons, but because he carried plans. Plans the West could not control. Plans that didn't ask for permission. Plans that would flip the global development game on its head. In the summer of 2026, Traoré unleashed the final version of what was internally dubbed Project Unshackle, a 10-step national transformation blueprint that he and his circle had crafted in near-complete secrecy for over 2 years. It wasn't just development. It was disruption designed not to uplift Burkina Faso within the existing global system, but to break free from it entirely. The first move seemed small: a tomato processing plant in the heart of an agro-cluster. But it wasn't about tomatoes. It was about control. For decades, Burkina Faso had exported raw crops and imported finished food products at triple the cost. Traoré knew that sovereignty didn't begin with soldiers. It began with supply chains. The plant was built without foreign aid, operated by local engineers, and priced to eliminate dependency on European-paced imports. In the first month alone, the plant saved the government over $1 million in import costs. That number alone made someone in Brussels very nervous. Then came the second move, a massive $120 million cross-border corridor highway from Bobo Dioulasso to the Ivorian coast, linking producers directly to global markets without passing through French-controlled logistics choke points. The road wasn't just concrete. It was a vein redirecting the bloodstream of trade and bleeding dry the arteries once controlled by Paris. France responded the only way it knew how. At the Élysée Palace, a private emergency intelligence memo was sent to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It read, "If not contained, the Traoré model will destabilize our economic foothold in Francophone West Africa. Immediate pressure required." But Traoré had already moved 3 steps ahead. The third strike came from above solar panels. Through the Yellen project, he began electrifying over 150 rural villages, using mini-grid solar power systems, severing their reliance on diesel imported through French-linked companies. Schools, hospitals, homes, all lit by the sun, maintained by local technicians, funded by state bonds, underwritten by Burkina Faso's newly created development treasury. And quietly, those same solar systems were linked to local surveillance networks that fed into a sovereign digital data center being constructed just outside Ouagadougou. By now, the CIA was paying attention. In Langley, a new file was created: TRE, status elevated to contingent threat. The term meant he was no longer considered just a regional anomaly. He was a model one that could be replicated. But Traoré was only getting started. His fourth move rattled the diplomatic corps: the launch of Birkenbank, a state-owned financial institution that operated independently of the CFA franc zone. It offered low-interest loans to farmers, women entrepreneurs, and cooperative builders. More importantly, it rejected Western bank compliance systems, opting instead for a decentralized ledger monitored by a Pan-African finance consortium based in Algeria. The first time the IMF requested access to Birkenbank's internal records, Traoré's finance minister replied, "We don't audit freedom." That line leaked, and it spread. In Paris, President Macron called an emergency meeting with West African governors still under French economic influence. The message: if Burkina Faso succeeds, our leverage in the region dissolves. We must act. In Washington, President Biden's Africa Advisory Council issued a 36-page report detailing Traoré's reforms, warning that non-aligned infrastructure is now the preferred template for youth-led governments. And then, Traoré detonated move number 5. The construction of 2 national data centers, code-named Vault Alpha and Vault Kadiogo, capable of storing national medical records. citizen data industrial designs, and encrypted state communications. For the first time in Burkina Faso's history, its digital sovereignty was no longer outsourced to French servers or US-based cloud systems. When Google and Amazon Web Services offered partnership packages, Traoré's chief technology officer sent back a one-line response. The cloud should reign where it is built. France retaliated by freezing $40 million in bilateral infrastructure grants. The US reevaluated its military cooperation program, and yet Burkina Faso's economy didn't shrink. It diversified. Russia increased its investment in energy infrastructure. China began quietly offering hardware. India sent 25 agricultural engineers to support local innovation labs in Ouahigouya. The West had tried to pull the plug, but the machine didn't stop. Because by move number 6, Traoré had already activated the economic firewall, the Sahelian Sovereign Procurement Act. Under this new law, no major government contract could be awarded to a foreign company unless 70% of the workforce and materials came from within the African continent. Multinational corporations from France, Canada, and Belgium were disqualified overnight from projects they had already bid on. Western ambassadors called it discriminatory. The Burkinabe Ministry of Trade called it justice delayed. The fallout from the Sahelian Sovereign Procurement Act was immediate and intense. Emails from the European Commission flew back and forth in coded urgency, referring to Burkina Faso as a strategic obstruction node in West Africa. French economic newspapers ran headlines accusing Traoré of economic nationalism gone rogue. In private meetings, EU trade officials began discussing retaliatory tariffs on Burkinabe exports. But Traoré had already anticipated this reaction. That was move number 7. Before the act was even announced, Burkina Faso had quietly entered a resource for infrastructure barter deal with Algeria and Iran. Under this agreement, Burkina Faso would supply raw gold phosphate and processed livestock products in exchange for steel fuel and construction materials without a single euro or dollar involved. No SWIFT codes, no Western banks, no surveillance. It was an ancient idea wrapped in modern logic value for value outside the system. Traoré's economic team called it Afro-Silk, a nod to a new trade corridor connecting Sahelian resilience with Mediterranean reach. But in Brussels and DC, they called it what it truly was, a threat. Burkina Faso wasn't just rejecting aid, it was rejecting architecture. By the time Move 8 was in motion, the CIA had flagged Traoré as non-compliant to Western frameworks, and for good reason. His government announced the establishment of a Pan-African Rare Earths Institute based in Ouagadougou, with satellite labs in Bamako and Niamey. This new institute would study, process, and license critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, manganese, not to foreign corporations, but to African-led tech startups and sovereign governments. For decades, these resources were plundered silently and shipped raw to European ports. Now, Burkina Faso was setting the price. When the French mining giant Aranex attempted to renew its extraction license, Traoré's Minister of Mining gave them a new contract with 87% of revenues redirected to the state, full environmental liability, and mandatory technology transfer to local labs. Aranex declined. Their repatriation was broadcast on national television. The crowd outside the airport cheered. In Washington, President Biden's senior Africa advisor delivered a now-leaked memo to the National Security Council. The title Burkina Faso is no longer a client state. The recommendation established covert counter-diplomatic containment in neighboring regions to dilute Traoré's influence. But the damage was done. The continent was watching. In Nairobi, a coalition of East African MPs proposed a similar procurement sovereignty bill. In Accra, the vice president of Ghana tweeted, "What Burkina Faso has done in 3 years, we have failed to do in 30. In South Africa, student groups began protesting IMF loan agreements and called Traoré a pan-African economist in military fatigues. But it was move number 9 that truly shifted the chessboard. the formation of AES, the Alliance for Economic Sovereignty, a formal economic bloc between Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, and Niger. More than just a free trade zone, AES established its own credit rating bureau, its own regional development fund, and perhaps most critically, a joint commodities reserve for food fuel and medical supplies. Within 6 months, the AES bloc had a liquidity pool larger than the annual foreign aid received by all 4 countries combined the year before. France panicked. The Quai d'Orsay summoned its ambassadors for an emergency consultation. One diplomat described the AES formation as economic warfare without declaration. Macron authorized the freezing of certain Franco-African diaspora bank accounts under the guise of national security. But all this only further cemented the image of a cornered empire lashing out, and Traoré. He had already prepared the final blow. Move 10 came not with a bang, but with a whisper. At a closed-door summit in Algiers, Traoré unveiled the Nouvelle Charte de l'Afrique, the new African Charter, a set of economic, cultural, and defense principles that explicitly rejected the Bretton Woods institutions, colonial-era borders, and foreign policy dictated from the West. The Charter proposed visa-free continental mobility, mutual defense protocols, sovereign currencies, and African control over educational and technological standards. But what shook the room most was Article 7 of the Charter. It read, "No African nation shall be sanctioned, embargoed, or isolated by foreign powers without triggering collective economic retaliation from all signatory states." It was Africa's Article 5, a declaration of unity. A line in the sand. Traoré returned to Ouagadougou that night without fanfare. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't gloat. He simply walked through the gates of the presidential compound, greeted the night guards with a nod, and disappeared into a briefing room where his young team of engineers and policy strategists were still awake working on rural irrigation models. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the White House Situation Room held a closed session. A senior staffer asked the room, "What do we do if this spreads?" The answer came from a defense analyst, eyes fixed on a screen showing solar panels gleaming in the Burkinabe desert. It already has. In the weeks that followed, silence fell across Western chancelleries, a silence not born from confusion, but from calculation. France doubled the intensity of its information operations. Anti-Traoré op-eds flooded international outlets. A fabricated story about Burkinabe human rights violations trended on European social media for 72 hours before being debunked. Washington, more subtle but no less reactive, dispatched special envoys to Dakar, Abidjan, and Accra with one mission: isolate the AES bloc diplomatically before it could solidify militarily. But Traoré had already anticipated that too. He quietly approved the creation of eDefense, a decentralized regional security network staffed by former intelligence officers from Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso. Trained not in traditional warfare, but in cyber defense, narrative control, and surveillance countermeasures, eDefense operated with a single purpose: prevent foreign destabilization before it could take root. Leaks were countered with digital transparency. Rumors were intercepted before they went viral, and every attempt to paint Traoré as a dictator was met not with censorship, but with open broadcasts showing solar farms, clean water pumps, bustling trade hubs, and young Burkinabe coding their own futures. And it worked. Public trust in state institutions soared past 80%, an unheard of number for a country once dismissed as unviable. Western embassies reported that Burkina Faso is now immune to external narrative manipulation. In Paris, one intelligence brief warned, "The people no longer believe us. They believe him." Meanwhile, Traoré made his boldest move yet, one that no spreadsheet drone or sanction could fully stop. He began exporting the blueprint. In December 2026, under complete media blackout, Traoré's government invited 5 other African states to a remote development retreat in the eastern forests of Burkina Faso. It wasn't a summit. It was a protocol laboratory, where ministers, engineers, and economists spent 2 weeks studying the legal, technical, and financial architecture behind every one of Traoré's 10 economic moves. Attendees were handed encrypted USB keys containing templates, procurement laws, agro-industry models, alternative energy financing plans, mobile banking algorithms, all open source. By the time the ministers returned to their home countries, the first Traoré institutes began forming research centers, policy cells, and sovereign strategy task forces, each committed to adapting the Burkina model to their own soil, not replicating, translating. In other words, the virus of sovereignty had mutated, and it was airborne. When a Bloomberg analyst asked why the West hadn't yet launched full-scale economic retaliation, a retired French diplomat gave a chillingly honest answer. Because sanctions only work when a target is alone. Traoré isn't alone anymore. Indeed, he was no longer the lone soldier in fatigues decrying dependency. He was now the quiet architect behind a geopolitical shift that had outpaced diplomacy, dodged traditional warfare, and sidestepped global finance by building new roads entirely. In January 2027, while Washington prepared for another election cycle and Paris clung to memories of empire, a new image emerged online. It showed a Burkinabe child walking through a newly paved school corridor, holding a lunchbox bearing the national slogan, "Build it ourselves." Below the image, someone had captioned, "The 10th move was not the charter. It was the children." That was Traoré's final checkmate. The real war was never just economic. It was generational. France can freeze accounts. The IMF can withhold loans. The West can smear and spin, but it cannot unteach what has been learned. It cannot unbuild what has been built. It cannot unawaken what has now risen. So yes, Ibrahim Traoré declared economic war, not with bombs, with blueprints. And for the first time in modern history, the world's most powerful nations are not fighting to crush an African nation's rebellion. They're scrambling to survive its example. And now the question echoing in the backrooms of Davos, Brussels, and Foggy Bottom is no longer, how do we stop Traoré? It's what if every African leader starts to think like him? As the world stumbled into the second half of 2011, the question that once haunted Western analysts had transformed into something far more terrifying. What if Traoré was just the beginning? Across Africa, the winds were shifting. In Accra University, students replaced Western political theory textbooks with translated Burkinabe policy manuals. In Kigali, the Rwandan Development Board requested a full audit of all foreign-funded projects, citing the Burkina Standard as their new benchmark. In Nairobi, a televised parliamentary debate ended with a thunderous motion. Let us cut the middleman. Let us look west less and south more. The spirit of Traoré was no longer a person, it had become a protocol. And back in Burkina Faso, the pace didn't slow. The government quietly opened the Ouagadougou Strategic School of Sovereignty, a university unlike any other on the continent. Its curriculum, a mixture of economic history, indigenous governance systems, legal self-defense against corporate predation, and sovereign tech development. Entry was by nomination only, with priority given to young leaders from marginalized regions across Africa. There were no scholarships from foreign donors, no professors from Harvard, just Africa, teaching Africa how to outgrow dependency with Traoré's own handwritten notes on statecraft, digitized and archived as required reading. This was the true legacy of the 10 moves. France tried one last time. A covert operation intended to destabilize the Burkinabe economy by infiltrating its new mobile banking system was exposed within 3 days. E-Defense released the names of 2 operatives along with intercepted transcripts. The French ambassador was summoned. A polite message was sent. This is your final warning. We will not fight you, but we will outlast you. In Washington, the mood was no better. The African Affairs Subcommittee convened a hearing on what they now referred to as the West African sovereignty crisis. The hearing was contentious. One congresswoman asked bluntly, "Did we spend 60 years building development frameworks only for a 35-year-old in combat boots to tear them down with a tomato plant and a broadband tower?" But the answer was already clear. Yes, because those frameworks were never built for independence, they were built for obedience. Meanwhile, at the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, Traoré refused to celebrate. His advisors urged him to mark the anniversary of the AES bloc with a grand address, but he declined. Instead, he requested a quiet inspection of the new high-speed rail station in Ziniare, a project still under construction. As he walked along the unfinished platform, children gathered by the fence, curious. One girl, no older than 8, held up a hand-drawn sketch of him, not in uniform, but as a farmer planting trees. She had written one word beneath it, Fasoba. Our builder. Traoré smiled for the first time that day, not because the West was afraid, not because the world was watching, but because the future for once was not borrowed. It was being made with calloused hands, unshakable pride, and the kind of silent strength that history would one day call revolution. No speeches, no fireworks, just another blueprint approved, another village connected, another school wired, and 10 moves that reshaped a continent without firing a single shot. In the end, Ibrahim Traoré did not declare economic war to destroy the West. He did it to save Africa from ever needing the West again, and that is why they panicked. Because for the first time in centuries, Africa stopped begging.